The White House never truly slept. Even in the dead of night, the glow of security lights stretched across Pennsylvania Avenue. The soft murmur of late-night staff echoed through the halls, and the faint hum of a city forever awake pressed in. From outside, Karoline Leavitt was still at her desk, the remnants of a long workday scattered around her, printed briefings, handwritten notes, an untouched cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She had planned to leave hours ago, but politics never operated on a schedule. Then she noticed it, a single envelope. It lay just inside her office, slipped under the heavy wooden door. No knock, no message, just the quiet presence of something that hadn't been there before. Her heartbeat slowed, steady but alert. She pushed her chair back, standing with measured caution, and crossed the room. The envelope was plain, unmarked. No postage, no official insignia. Someone had gone through the trouble of delivering this personally. She knelt slightly, picking it up, her fingers running over the thick paper. She flipped it over. No return. Address. No indication of who had sent it. Carefully, she tore the top open. A stack of documents slid out, clipped together, dense with information. At first glance, they looked like ordinary reports, financial statements, correspondences, case files. But then she saw the names: judges, senators, CEOs of major corporations. Her fingers tightened around the pages as she scanned through them, each line more damning than the last. Wire transfers, offshore accounts, deals made behind closed doors, masked as legislation, enforced by the very people sworn to uphold justice. This wasn't just corruption. This was systemic. Karoline exhaled, turning to the final page. Unlike the others, this one wasn't neatly formatted or typed. A single sentence was scrawled across the bottom in hurried, almost frantic handwriting. "Be careful. They spare no one." The words settled in her chest like lead. Someone had risked everything to get this to her. Someone who knew what she would do once she saw it. She clutched the folder tightly, her jaw tightening. This was no longer about politics, no longer about policy. This was a war, and now she was in the center of it. The morning sun had barely risen over Washington, D.C. when the knock came. Not a polite tap, not an aide announcing an early meeting. A sharp, authoritative pounding against the heavy White House doors. Karoline Leavitt looked up from her desk, her instincts kicking in before her mind fully processed what was happening. Within seconds, Michael Carter, her most trusted aide, rushed in, his face unusually tense. "FBI," he said, his voice low but urgent. "They're here for you." Karoline's grip on her coffee mug tightened. She set it down carefully, exhaling as she stood. "On what grounds?" Michael handed her a printed document. A subpoena. Subject: Karoline Leavitt. Allegations: aiding an extremist organization, media manipulation, threats to national security. Karoline almost laughed. So this is their move. She adjusted her blazer, grabbed the subpoena, and walked out. The agents were already waiting. The lead agent, a man with graying hair and a practiced expression of neutrality, held up his badge. "Miss Leavitt, we need you to come with us for questioning." "Of course," Karoline said smoothly. "Wouldn't want to inconvenience the Bureau." The ride to the FBI field office was silent. No one spoke, but Karoline could feel the tension thick in the air. She wasn't just another citizen being brought in for questioning. She was the White House press secretary, and this was an open declaration of war. Inside the interrogation room, the air was stale, the walls painted a dull, lifeless gray. Two agents sat across from her, recording devices set up, files stacked neatly in front of them. "Miss Leavitt," the lead agent began, sliding a document toward her, "we have reason to believe you've been in contact with individuals connected to an extremist organization." Karoline glanced down at the paper. They were reaching. The accusations were vague, flimsy, just enough to justify dragging her in, but not enough to hold up in court. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. And what extremist organization would that be? The agent's lips pressed into a thin line. "We have intelligence linking certain political operatives to underground networks spreading disinformation. Your recent activities suggest involvement." Karoline smirked. "You mean exposing corruption?" The second agent spoke this time, his voice colder. "Miss Leavitt, we're offering you an opportunity. Cooperate, and this doesn't have to escalate." There it was. The real reason she was here. They weren't trying to arrest her. They were trying to scare her, to make her hesitate. Karoline let a slow silence stretch before she finally spoke. "If you think intimidation is going to work on me, you're more desperate than I thought." The lead agent sighed. "We're done here. No charges, no real threats, just an attempt to make her back down." They escorted her out of the room, but Karoline wasn't shaken. If anything, she was more sure than ever. They were afraid of what she knew. Her phone buzzed the moment she stepped outside. Unknown number. She opened the message. "Give up, or you'll be next to disappear." Karoline exhaled slowly, tucking her phone back into her pocket. They wanted her to be afraid. Too bad. She was just getting started. The moment Karoline Leavitt stepped out of the FBI field office, she knew she had two choices: stay quiet and let them bury her, or strike back so hard that they couldn't ignore her. For her, it wasn't a choice at all. By the time she returned to her office, she was already making calls. First to a handful of trusted conservative members of Congress, then to independent journalists, ones who weren't owned by corporate media giants. Finally, to a network of constitutional lawyers who had built their careers fighting against government overreach. The message was clear. They tried to take me down. Now we take the fight to them. Michael Carter, her closest aide, stood by as she laid out the plan. "Karoline, if we go public with this, they'll double down. You know that, right?" Karoline glanced up from her desk, a fire in her eyes. "Let them." She pulled out the thick folder, the same one that had been slipped under her door just the night before. There were too many names, too many connections, and too many deals made in the shadows for this to be ignored. She wasn't going to release everything, not yet. She only needed a spark. That afternoon, she made her move. A single document. One that linked a sitting judge, a major corporate CEO, and a high-ranking senator in a blatant exchange of power and money. Karoline sent it to 3 journalists, uploaded it to a private server, and with a single keystroke, released it online. Then she waited. She didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, Jaka Deep State Files was trending on Twitter. Within 3 hours, conservative media outlets picked up the story. Within 5 hours, millions of Americans were questioning the very foundation of the justice system. Fox News. Explosive documents reveal corruption at the highest levels. Daily Wire. Who really runs Washington? Leaked files spark nationwide debate. Social media posts. We always suspected the system was rigged. Now we have proof. Deep State Files. Karoline scrolled through the headlines, her grip tightening. On her phone, the system wanted to silence her. Instead, she had just given America a reason to listen. The city was quiet, but Karoline Leavitt's mind was anything but. She sat in the green room of a major news studio, reviewing her notes before a highly anticipated live interview. The air was thick with anticipation. Tonight she would expose more about the corruption ring that had Washington on edge. Then her phone buzzed, a message from Michael Carter. "Urgent, call me now." She didn't hesitate. The line barely rang before Michael's voice came through, tight and controlled. "Karoline, it's bad. They just found Daniel Reed dead." The words landed like a gunshot. Daniel Reed, the former court clerk, the man who had leaked documents proving judicial corruption, one of the few people willing to go on record. Karoline's fingers clenched around the phone. "How?" Michael hesitated. "Suicide. That's what they're saying. Karoline closed her eyes for a brief second. Of course, suicide, the official story every time someone got too close to the truth. A deep breath steadied her, but her pulse had already quickened. They were sending a message. She turned to the mirror. In front of her, staring at her own reflection. They think this will stop me. They had no idea. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Karoline had met with Daniel 2 nights ago, and she had recorded everything, his testimony, his fears, the names he knew, the files he had access to. The only thing his death proved was that he had told the truth. Her phone buzzed again, this time a new text, unknown number. People who don't know when to quit end up like Reed. Karoline let out a slow, sharp breath. She stood, adjusting the silver cross on her blazer, and grabbed her notes. They had just made their biggest mistake, because now she wasn't just exposing corruption, she was avenging the truth. Karoline Leavitt sat under the blinding studio lights, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Across from her, the veteran news anchor leaned forward, his tone carefully measured. "Miss Leavitt," he began, "are you saying that the recent death of Daniel Reed wasn't a suicide?" Karoline took a slow breath, then looked straight into the camera. "I'm not saying anything," she replied. "I'm proving it." She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a flash drive. "This," she said, holding it up, "it contains a recording of Daniel Reed's testimony. He feared for his life. He knew he was being followed, and now he's dead." The anchor looked momentarily stunned. The control room went silent. This wasn't speculation. This was evidence. Karoline placed the drive on the desk between them. "I'm giving this to the American people." The network aired the recording. Daniel's voice, steady but nervous, echoed through millions of living rooms across the country. "I saw the emails. The judges, the senators, they were all involved. If this gets out, I won't be safe, but people need to know the truth." The impact was instant. Udry justice for Reed trended worldwide. Fox News, explosive revelation, whistleblower's death exposed. Daily Wire, Karoline Leavitt's bombshell interview shakes Washington. Social media posts, she just took on the entire system, live. On air, unreal. By morning, Congress had no choice. A formal investigation was launched into the corruption scandal. Karoline had turned the tide, or so she thought. Her victory was short-lived. Just as she stepped out of the news studio, a fleet of black SUVs pulled up. Armed agents swarmed the entrance. An FBI agent stepped forward, holding up a warrant. "Karoline Leavitt," he announced, "you're under arrest for obstruction of a federal investigation." The cameras were still rolling. The world was still watching. And the war was far from over. The moment the cold steel cuffs locked around Karoline Leavitt's wrists, the cameras were already rolling. The flashing lights, the reporters shouting questions, the live broadcasts. It was all unfolding in real time. But she wasn't afraid. She had already planned for this. As the FBI agents led her to the black SUV, her phone was nowhere to be found. She had handed it off to Michael Carter minutes before the arrest. And with it, the original documents, the very proof they were, trying to silence. By the time she reached the federal detention center, her team had already set the plan in motion. Conservative politicians, legal experts, and independent journalists flooded the airwaves, demanding answers. This isn't justice. This is political persecution. Karoline Leavitt exposed corruption, and now they're trying to bury her. If they can do this to her, they can do it to anyone. And then came the biggest wave yet. "Ye Free Karoline" exploded across social media, trending worldwide within hours. Fox News, public outrage as Karoline Leavitt is arrested, political retaliation. The Daily Wire, a government scandal unraveling. They're desperate to stop her. Twitter posts, She exposed the truth. Now they want her silenced. Free Karoline. Under growing pressure, the government scrambled to control the fallout. The Department of Justice issued a vague statement. The situation is under review. Then, an emergency hearing was called. By the end of the week, with the weight of public scrutiny crushing down on them, officials had no choice. The charges were put on hold. Karoline was released. As she stepped out of the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers. Supporters held signs, cameras flashed, and chants of "We stand with Karoline" echoed through the streets. She adjusted the silver cross on her blazer, took a deep breath, and faced the cameras. They had tried to silence her. Instead, they had turned her into a symbol. The system shakes up. The shockwaves of Karoline Leavitt's arrest and release had barely settled before Washington, D.C. was thrown into chaos. Within 24 hours, multiple congressional committees announced emergency investigations into judicial and political corruption. Reports surfaced of secret deals, hidden accounts, and a deeply entrenched network manipulating the legal system from the shadows. The public was outraged, the government was scrambling, and the resignations had already begun. A system in freefall. Karoline sat in her office, scanning the latest reports. 4 resignations so far, Michael Carter, her chief aide, muttered, scrolling through his phone. He looked up. And they're not small names. He handed her a list. Judge Kenneth Doyle, U.S. Court of Appeals, resigned for personal reasons. Senator Richard Ellison, Judiciary Committee member, announced sudden retirement. Deputy Attorney General Lisa Farrow stepped down amid ethics concerns. Vincent Hale, corporate lobbyist tied to federal contracts, cut. All business ties fled to a private estate in the Caribbean. Karoline exhaled, tapping her fingers on the desk. They're running. Michael nodded. They know what's coming. But this was just the start. To ensure the fight didn't end with a few sacrificial resignations, a special commission was announced, tasked with conducting a full-scale investigation into the judiciary and legislative system. Led by independent prosecutors and bipartisan oversight, its sole purpose was to uncover every name, every dollar, and every abuse of power. And the first target? The judges. The televised confession. The hearing room was packed. The energy was electric. Washington elites, legal analysts, and the press all sat in stunned silence as one of the country's most senior judges, Justice Clarence Whitmore, took the witness stand. For years, Whitmore had been considered untouchable, a pillar of the judicial system. But now, he was cornered. A congressman leaned forward, microphone in hand. "Your Honor," he began, voice measured but sharp. "Did you, at any point, engage in politically motivated rulings?" A long pause. The cameras zoomed in. Every network carried the hearing live. Whitmore shifted in his seat, his fingers clenching the edges of the table. He had spent decades commanding courtrooms, yet now, in front of the American people, he was the one being judged. He swallowed hard. "I was pressured." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Karoline, watching from her office, leaned forward. The congressman didn't let up. "By whom?" Whitmore hesitated, then let out a slow, defeated breath. "Senators, lobbyists, corporate figures, they influenced cases, told us which rulings would be best for the system, and I complied." The room exploded. Shouts from committee members, reporters frantically typing, live broadcasts cut to legal analysts, stunned by what they had just heard. Karoline sat back, her fingers lightly tracing the silver cross pinned to her blazer. They had tried to silence her. Instead, they had exposed themselves. And now, the entire system was unraveling. A new revolution. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface of America finally boiled over. Millions poured into the streets. From Washington, D.C. to the heartlands of Texas, from New York to Florida, the people demanded justice. Not just for Karoline Leavitt, not just for Daniel Reed, but for a system that had been rigged against them for decades. Signs flooded the air. No more secret courts. Justice for the people, not the elite. Transparency now. In front of the Supreme Court, a crowd of nearly 500,000 gathered, chanting, "We want justice," as politicians, media figures, and activists scrambled to control the narrative. But it was no longer in their hands. A law to change the system. Under mounting public pressure, Congress had no choice but to act. Late one evening, in an emergency session of the National Assembly, lawmakers debated a historic bill, the Judicial Transparency and Accountability Act. Its key provisions were clear: mandatory disclosure of judicial lobbying. All meetings between judges and political operatives must be publicly recorded. Real-time case tracking, ensuring that no case could be buried or manipulated behind closed doors. Whistleblower protections, so that future Daniel Reeds could come forward without ending up as another suicide. The vote was held just past midnight. Passed 81-19 in the Senate, 327-108 in the House. A monumental shift in the country's legal system, one that had once seemed impossible. The face of the movement. At the center of it all was Karoline Leavitt. She was no longer just the White House press secretary, no longer just a voice for religious freedom. She had become something more, a symbol for transparency, for justice, for every American who had ever been silenced, ignored, or punished for standing up to corruption. As she stepped onto the White House balcony, the roar of the crowd outside filled the air. She adjusted the silver cross on her blazer, let the moment settle, and spoke 3 simple words into the microphone. "We are unstoppable." The revolution had begun, and this time the people were leading it. The war isn't over. In a darkened room deep inside Capitol Hill, a group of men sat around a polished mahogany table. The glow of a projector flickered against the walls, illuminating a single image on the screen. Karoline Leavitt. A man in a tailored navy suit leaned forward, his fingers steepled together. A congressman, but not just any congressman, one of the few who had never appeared in the corruption files. The kind of man who operated in the shadows, beyond the reach of investigations. "She thinks she's won," he murmured, his voice low and measured. "But we have more cards to play." Another man, older, grayer, exhaled sharply. "She's exposed too much already. The media's turning against us." "The people, they're fickle," the congressman interrupted. "They rally behind whoever gives them the best show. We let them celebrate their little victory, and then when the moment is right, we remind them who really runs this country." The room fell silent. The plan was already in motion. Another secret, another battle. At that same moment across Washington, Karoline sat in her White House office, the echoes of the day's celebration still ringing outside. She allowed herself a rare moment of quiet, leaning back in her chair, rubbing her temples. Then she noticed it, an envelope, not slipped under her door like before. This time it was placed neatly at the center of her desk, waiting. Karoline's stomach tightened. She knew the game well enough now. This wasn't a victory lap. This was the next move. She picked up the file and flipped it open. Her breath hitched. Another corruption ring, bigger, dirtier, more untouchable than the last. This wasn't over, not even close. Karoline exhaled, gripping the file tighter. They still didn't understand. She wasn't the type to back down. She was the type to burn them all down. And so the war continued. Open ending. A warning for the deep power. The storm had only begun to form, but Washington already felt its weight. News networks speculated. Whispers in Congress grew louder. The streets, once filled with celebration, now buzzed with unease. Everyone knew something was coming, but no one knew what. In the corridors of power, the men in the shadows were no longer just watching. They were stepping forward. Political operatives who had once stayed behind closed doors now made public appearances, spinning new narratives. Senators who had remained quiet during the hearings suddenly had plenty to say about security threats, misinformation, and the dangers of unchecked populism. It was clear the system wasn't done fighting, but neither was Karoline Leavitt. She stood outside the White House, the city lights casting a faint glow on the silver cross pinned to her blazer. She could feel it in the air. The next battle, the next war, they were coming for her, and she was ready.